A story has entered history, a story shaped by 3 simple sentences. Those 3 sentences silenced a room full of world leaders, disrupted a global summit, and made even one of the most powerful men in America question his own words. It was a moment when dignity stood firm against arrogance, when quiet strength overwhelmed ostentatious noise, and when the world witnessed what happens when someone finally dares to say what everyone has thought, but no one had the courage to voice. This was not merely a matter of politics or diplomacy. It was a moment when truth pierced through all pretenses, like a sharp blade cutting through soft silk, leaving the room frozen, revealing the stark reality of true power. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. The granite walls and intellectual atmosphere of the Carnegie Institute in Washington, D.C. have witnessed countless fiery debates and policy-shaping ideas. Here, seasoned diplomats, esteemed scholars, and top policymakers have analyzed global challenges together. Yet, despite hosting countless significant events, absolutely nothing could have prepared this intellectual space for what was about to unfold on this crisp autumn morning. The Strategic Dialogue Forum was not an ordinary government meeting. It was a gathering of influential voices where ideas were honed and perspectives clashed. This was where complex concepts of national security and development aid were dissected, and where the phrase global responsibility was analyzed through various lenses. Every speaker was carefully selected, each presentation meticulously prepared, creating an atmosphere of serious scholarship but also vibrant energy. Security at the event was tightened to an almost unbelievable degree, surpassing even the most advanced bank vault. Metal detectors beeped incessantly, X-ray scanners scrutinized every bag, and a dense contingent of armed guards was sufficient to control an entire small territory. Every entrance was closely monitored, every guest rigorously screened, and likely every conversation recorded. The U.S. government took no chances with this gathering of global powers. Inside the main auditorium, enormous crystal chandeliers cast a shimmering light, reflecting off perfectly arranged rows of seats. The main stage was elegantly set with a white draped table, neatly placed crystal water glasses, and a meticulously tested microphone system, down to the smallest detail, to ensure perfect sound quality, guaranteeing every word was delivered clearly and powerfully. This was the heart of the event, where the world's most influential voices would discuss the future of international aid, global development strategies, and the concept of shared prosperity, a concept often mentioned but not always fulfilled in its true sense. The guest list was like a golden registry of the planet's most influential figures: senior diplomats from G7 nations, chairs of international development finance organizations, CEOs of leading tech corporations, and esteemed scholars. They moved confidently through the main hall, exchanging business cards and polite greetings, but beneath the surface lay strategic calculations. Photographers clicked away, capturing every forced smile and carefully staged handshake. A subtle air of self-satisfaction permeated the space, an unspoken sense that everyone in the room belonged to an elite class that had done right and was now gathered to decide the fate of those who had not yet done right. However, 2 men in that room did not entirely fit the typical mold of an international diplomatic event in New York. They stood out, not through ostentation, but through a profound difference in character and approach. The first was President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. At 35, he was strikingly young by the standards of a head of state, a stark contrast to most of the seasoned leaders present at the summit. But his eyes carried a deep concern and the weight of struggle, a gaze far beyond his years. He arrived without a grand entourage, no sleek black SUVs, no extensive team of advisors, and no press secretary managing his image. He came quietly, almost invisibly, wearing his signature olive-green military uniform instead of the expensive suits worn by others. Traore had risen to power through a coup, overthrowing a government seen as too cozy with foreign interests. His staunch anti-colonial stance and call for absolute African sovereignty made him a hero to his people, but a serious threat to the old order. Western governments watched him cautiously and with unease, uncertain whether he was a reformer or a radical revolutionary. What they agreed on was that he was unpredictable, a trait that always unnerved diplomats, as unpredictability defied every traditional principle. The second was Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a towering figure in American politics, known for his long Senate career and a strong, often sharp, voice in foreign policy. He entered the building with a calm but confident demeanor, reflecting the undeniable influence of the United States in global institutions. Dressed in a perfectly tailored suit and exuding polished professionalism, he carried an air of authority and responsibility. Accompanying him was a team of advisors and security personnel, ever vigilant agents, policy advisors, exchanging last-minute information, communications staff ready for any scenario, and others whose job was to ensure the secretary was presented professionally and credibly in every setting. Secretary Rubio's views on Africa and international aid had long been clear and often sparked heated debates. Unlike some who saw aid as pure charity, he viewed international assistance as a strategic tool, a lever to secure political, economic, and security benefits for the United States. To him, these investments were not just generosity, but part of a broader foreign policy to ensure compliance and cooperation from recipient nations. He often emphasized that international aid must be used efficiently, delivering tangible results and serving U.S. national interests, not merely as an expense. While sometimes criticized as overly pragmatic or lacking compassion, this stance aligned with his political philosophy of maximizing value from every international commitment. The morning sessions at the Strategic Dialogue Forum proceeded as scripted. Carefully prepared speeches about sustainable development goals echoed through the auditorium, alongside carefully worded commitments to ongoing partnerships. The diplomatic language was so skillfully crafted that it said all the right things while committing to nothing specific. There were eloquent words about cooperation, consensus, and a shared prosperous future, but they often lacked detailed action plans or binding commitments. Delegates from government officials to NGO representatives and journalists nodded politely and jotted down notes that would likely never be revisited. There was a sense of familiarity, a long-established rhythm at such forums, where exchanges of ideas typically remain safe and polite, avoiding any controversy that might cause offense. Everyone displayed professionalism, but beneath it lay an anticipation, a longing to witness something that would truly break through the wall of conformity. However, all attention was focused on the main event scheduled for the afternoon. A dialogue titled Global Responsibility and the Future of Aid. This was the centerpiece everyone was eager to witness. The session featured heads of state and the world's top development leaders discussing the direction and strategies for the next decade of international cooperation. The atmosphere in the room shifted noticeably. As the lunch break ended and delegates began returning to the auditorium, an unusual, almost tangible sense of anticipation spread through the air, unlike anything felt that morning. Perhaps it was the convergence of strong personalities, leaders with differing visions and interests coming together. Perhaps it was the weight of increasingly urgent global challenges, demanding real, bold solutions. Or perhaps simply it was time for someone to say what needed to be said, what had long been hidden beneath layers of polite diplomacy and evasive rhetoric. There was a sense that a pivotal moment was approaching, a tipping point everyone felt but no one dared to name. Secretary of State Marco Rubio sat prominently at the section reserved for key speakers and the U.S. delegation on the main stage. As the head of U.S. diplomacy, his position clearly reflected his importance and influence in shaping U.S. foreign policy. Though not the head of the executive branch, his voice and perspective carried significant weight, representing a critical part of the U.S. administration. From this position, he could easily address and engage with the entire forum, where other international leaders were also present to share their views. Beside him were leaders like President Emmanuel Macron of France, Chancellor Friedrich Merz of Germany, and Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni of Italy, along with Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada, Prime Minister Ishiba Shigeru of Japan, and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese of Australia, all present in the hall or at other speaker positions, ready to present their national perspectives. All were perfectly positioned, impeccably dressed, and prepared for the critical dialogue. President Ibrahim Traoré sat at the end of the table for secondary speakers or in an area designated for international guests with special roles. His position was almost isolated from the core group of Western leaders. This seating arrangement was neither random nor an oversight. Seating at such events is calculated to the smallest detail, clearly reflecting the hierarchy and underlying power dynamics in international diplomacy. His position was deeply symbolic, present, but on the periphery of the circle of power, invited, but not placed at the center of the discussion. It was a subtle but clear reminder of the power dynamics that have governed international relations for decades, where some nations' voices are prioritized over others. The session's moderator, Professor Elias Thorne, a seasoned diplomat who had chaired countless similar discussions over 2 decades, cleared his throat to draw attention and began with formal greetings. Esteemed leaders, distinguished guests, we gather here today to discuss one of the most critical challenges facing the global community. How do we ensure that international development aid creates sustainable, lasting change while respecting the sovereignty and dignity of recipient nations? It was a classic question, capable of generating hours of discussion without requiring a specific answer. It was perfect for diplomatic settings, where the goal is often to appear effective and well-intentioned while avoiding truly binding commitments. The initial responses unfolded as expected, safe, cautious, and constructive, but not groundbreaking. Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada spoke about the importance of partnerships and mutual respect. Chancellor Friedrich Merz of Germany emphasized evidence-based development strategies, highlighting efficiency and science in resource allocation. Prime Minister Ishiba Shigeru of Japan contributed by focusing on the role of innovation and technology in promoting sustainable development in developing nations. Each speech was polished, carefully considered, and entirely forgettable. Then Professor Elias Thorne, the moderator, turned to Marco Rubio. Mr. Secretary, the United States remains the world's largest provider of foreign aid. How do you see the U.S. role in global development moving forward? Rubio leaned slightly toward the microphone. A subtle but palpable shift spread through the room. The diplomatic finesse, carefully chosen words, and measured responses seemed on the verge of being shattered. Professor Thorne, perhaps it's time we get to the point instead of dancing around with diplomatic jargon, Rubio began, his voice carrying the familiar sharpness that had defined his political career. Everyone in this room knows the truth, but no one wants to say it. He stood, pushing his chair back with more force than necessary. The sound of the chair scraping echoed through the suddenly silent auditorium. We've given Africa more money than any other continent in history, he declared. Schools, hospitals, roads, clean water, food, aid, you name it, we've paid for it. And not just us Americans, but everyone sitting here. European nations, Japan, Canada, we've poured trillions of dollars into Africa over the past 50 years. Professor Thorne shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing that this dialogue would not follow the planned script. "Mr. Secretary, perhaps we could discuss specific programs and their measurable impacts." Rubio raised a hand, cutting Thorne off. "I'm not done, because this is what no one wants to admit. After all that money, after all that help, what do we get? Complaints, criticism, and frankly, disrespect." A murmur rippled through the audience. Cameras panned quickly to the faces of the guests. Some looked uncomfortable, others intrigued by the breach of diplomatic protocol. "I mean, look at this room," Rubio continued, gesturing decisively. "Half the infrastructure that got these leaders here today was built with Western aid money. The airports, roads, telecom networks that let them tweet their complaints about us. We paid for that." He began pacing in front of the podium, gaining momentum as if in a critical strategy meeting rather than a diplomatic forum. "And instead of gratitude, instead of cooperation, what do we hear? Neo-colonialism, Western imperialism, structural exploitation. Give me a break." President Emmanuel Macron of France looked as if he'd swallowed something bitter. Chancellor Friedrich Merz of Germany stared intently at his notes, his expression unreadable. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni of Italy gripped her hands tightly, her eyes pensive. Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada, Prime Minister Ishiba Shigeru of Japan, and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese of Australia each displayed distinct reactions, but all shared a sense of surprise at the unyielding bluntness. But President Ibrahim Traoré sat still, his dark eyes fixed on Secretary Rubio with an almost tangible intensity, not moving or showing emotion. "Some of these leaders act like they built their countries from scratch," Rubio continued, his voice rising, "as if they rose up without any help from anyone. But we all know that's not true. We handed them progress on a silver platter, and the least they could do is say, 'Thank you.'" He turned and looked directly at President Traoré for the first time. "Some of you, these young revolutionaries, think you can ignore the help you've received and pretend you did it all on your own. But that's not how the world works. Success demands acknowledging those who made it possible." The silence that followed was deafening, not the polite quiet of diplomatic consideration, but the stunned silence of a room full of people unable to believe what they'd just heard. Professor Elias Thorne opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again like a fish gasping on dry land. Finally, Professor Thorne found his voice. "President Traoré, would you like to respond to these remarks?" President Ibrahim Traoré rose slowly. No grand gestures, no dramatic flourishes. He simply stood from his chair with the grace of someone completely at ease. Unlike Rubio's earlier performance, charged with motion, President Traoré's stillness commanded attention through sheer presence. He did not move to the central podium. He needed no props or staging. He stood in place, hands at his sides, and spoke in a calm voice that somehow filled every corner of the vast auditorium. "You have given us money," he began, each word deliberate and firm. "This is true." The simplicity of his opening caught everyone off guard. No diplomatic preamble, no flowery language, just a direct acknowledgement of the truth. "But with every dollar," he continued, his voice growing slightly stronger, "you have taken our dignity." Those words landed like a physical force in the room. Delegates checking their phones suddenly looked up. Journalists stopped typing. Even the security personnel seemed to lean in closer. "And today," President Traoré said, his eyes never leaving Rubio's face, "I return both." Silence that followed was not just stillness. It was a void, as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. No one moved, no one breathed. The only sound was the faint, almost inaudible hum of the air conditioning system. Rubio's confident expression faltered for a moment, a flicker of unease, perhaps even surprise. Clearly, he had not anticipated such a direct, unflinching response. "That's dramatic," Rubio said. attempting to regain control. But drama doesn't change the facts. But President Traoré was not finished. He stepped closer to the microphone, his voice now resonating through every corner of the room. "Aid is not charity when it comes with chains," he said. "You build hospitals, yes, but you write our health policies. You send grain, but you take our gold. You provide loans, but you own our resources. You call it help, we call it a transaction." Professor Elias Thorne desperately scanned his notes, searching for a way to regain control of the session. The other world leaders sat still, caught between diplomatic protocol and genuine fascination with this unprecedented moment. "Every road you pave comes with conditions," President Traoré continued. "Every school you build requires us to buy your textbooks, teach your languages, adopt your systems. Every hospital you fund must purchase your drugs, train in your methods, follow your procedures. This is not generosity. This is business." Now he moved, taking 3 deliberate steps toward the center of the stage where Rubio stood. His military bearing was evident in every motion, controlled, purposeful, commanding. "You talk of gratitude as if we should thank the hand that feeds us while it picks our children's pockets. You demand appreciation for help that always costs more than it gives. You want applause for support that makes us more dependent, not more free." Rubio leaned toward the microphone, his face slightly pale. "That's entirely unfair. We've saved millions of lives through our aid programs. We've prevented famines, stopped diseases, built infrastructure that—" President Traoré raised a hand not aggressively, not dismissively, but with a quiet authority that made Secretary Rubio's words simply stop mid-sentence. The gesture was almost gentle, like a teacher calming an overeager student, but its effect was absolute. "I do not deny that lives have been saved," President Traoré said. "I do not dispute the roads or hospitals or schools, but I will not pretend that salvation came without a cost, or that the cost was fair." He paused, letting his words settle. When he continued, his voice carried a weight that made everyone in the room lean slightly forward. True power does not need to announce itself. It does not need to demand gratitude or list its achievements. True power creates, empowers, and then steps back to let others thrive. What you describe is not power. It is dependence dressed in the guise of authority. The remark was sharp enough to stun. Around the table, other world leaders found themselves questioning their consciences, wondering if they had been mistaking control for leadership, management for empowerment. "You mock us for needing help, then design systems to ensure we will always need more. You criticize our dependence, then structure aid in ways that deepen it. You complain about our ingratitude while building relationships that make genuine gratitude impossible." Marco Rubio was now visibly struggling, his usual confidence replaced by the discomfort of someone unaccustomed to being outmaneuvered intellectually in public. "Look, I never said—" But President Traoré pressed on, his cadence now almost hypnotic, each sentence rolling into the next like waves hitting the shore. "The hand that gives can be generous, or it can be possessive. It can open doors, or it can create locks. It can plant seeds, or it can uproot. You have chosen possession over generosity, locks over doors, uprooting over planting." The metaphors were simple enough for all to grasp, yet profound enough to carry layers of meaning. This was not just political rhetoric, it was poetry with purpose. And now you stand before the world, frustrated that your possession does not produce love, that your locks do not create security, that your uprooting does not yield gratitude. You blame us for not appreciating a gift that was never freely given. The rebuke stung deeply precisely because it was not angry. President Traoré's tone remained calm, almost gentle. He did not shout or gesture wildly. He simply laid out the truth with the clarity of someone who had thought deeply about these issues long before this moment. "For 60 years you have told us we are children who need guidance. You have structured every interaction to confirm our dependence and your wisdom. You have built institutions designed to help us, but only in ways that make you essential to our progress. Now the other world leaders looked genuinely uneasy, because while President Traore was speaking directly to Secretary Rubio, his words applied to nearly every developed nation's approach to international aid. Then you wonder why we don't trust you. You wonder why younger leaders question your motives. You wonder why the gratitude you expect never materializes. He paused again, and in that brief silence, something shifted in the room. The power dynamic that seemed so clear when Secretary Rubio was speaking had completely reversed. Now Rubio looked like the one being lectured, the one on the defensive. But this is what you truly cannot understand, President Traore continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow seemed louder than a shout. Dignity cannot be given. It can only be recognized or destroyed. You have spent decades destroying our dignity while demanding thanks for the privilege. The words landed like hammer blows, each one placed precisely for maximum impact. You have given us money, yes, but with every dollar you have taken our dignity. You provide aid, but you strip our sovereignty. You offer help, but you demand submission. And today, in this room, before these witnesses, I return both the money and your expectations. Those final sentences arrived with the inevitability of dawn, as if everything that had come before was merely preparation for this moment of absolute clarity. We no longer need your helping hand if it comes with a controlling arm. We no longer want your support if it requires our weakening. We no longer accept your charity if the cost is our dignity. And then, the three sentences that set social media ablaze, words that would be quoted in history books, defining this moment for generations to come. You have given us money, but with every dollar, you have taken our dignity. And today, I return both. The silence that followed defied description. It was not just that people stopped speaking, it was as if the entire concept of sound had been suspended. Time seemed to freeze, breaths held, hearts paused between beats. Secretary Marco Rubio stood there, his mouth slightly open. Perhaps, for the first time in his political career, he was utterly speechless. The man who had built his brand on never backing down, never admitting weakness, never yielding, now stood silent and somehow smaller than he had just moments before. Around the table, world leaders sat motionless. Some looked confused, others uncomfortable, but all recognized they had witnessed something unprecedented. This was not just a diplomatic exchange gone off script. It was a fundamental power dynamic being rewritten in real time. The audience of delegates, journalists, and observers sat in absolute silence. Phone screens that had flickered with social media updates were now dark and forgotten. This was a moment that demanded complete attention, a confrontation that would be remembered long after policy details had faded. Professor Elias Thorne, the moderator, looked like a man watching his carefully planned dinner party spontaneously combust. He had prepared notes for every possible direction the conversation might take. But nothing could have prepared him for this level of unfiltered truth. Finally, after what felt like hours but was likely only about 30 seconds, Rubio attempted a response. His voice, when it came, lacked its usual conviction. That's a very interesting perspective, he said, the words sounding hollow even to himself. But I think we need to consider the actual results of our aid programs, the measurable outcomes, the lives improved. It was a desperate attempt to return to safe ground, to pull the conversation back to statistics and policy details where he could regain his footing. But the moment had moved beyond his control. President Traore did not interrupt this time. He simply waited, letting Secretary Rubio's words sink into the silence, demonstrating through his patience that he did not need to compete for attention or fight for space. His point had been made, and it would stand regardless of the response. When Secretary Rubio finished his attempted rebuttal, President Traore spoke once more, his final words in the exchange. Numbers tell us what happened. Truth tells us why it happened. Today I have given you the truth. Tomorrow we will create new numbers. And with that, he sat down. The moderator, recognizing that any attempt to continue the dialogue would fall flat, called for a break, but no one moved. Delegates sat frozen, still processing what they had witnessed. Journalists scrambled to jot down quotes and reactions, while cameramen panned to faces in the room, capturing expressions of shock, admiration, discomfort, and awe. Within minutes, phone screens began lighting up across the auditorium. Social media notifications buzzed incessantly as videos of the exchange began to spread. Hashtags like #InReturn and #TodayIReturn both started trending even before the moderator formally ended the session. Secretary Rubio's staff huddled anxiously, whispering urgent conversations about damage control and response strategies. But what could they say? How do you spin a moment so clear, a truth so perfectly articulated? Meanwhile, President Traore sat calmly in his seat, showing no trace of triumph for his victory or anxiety about potential consequences. He looked like a man who had simply done what needed to be done, said what needed to be said, and was now ready to move on to whatever came next. As delegates began to leave the auditorium, many paused to shake President Traore's hand or offer quiet words of support. Others approached more cautiously, as if unsure whether aligning with him carried political risks. Outside the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a young BBC journalist caught up with President Traore as he stepped out. "Mr. President," she called, hurrying to match his steady stride. That was an incredible confrontation inside. Are you concerned about the diplomatic fallout? Are you worried that such direct criticism could harm Burkina Faso's relationships with Western donors? President Traore paused, turning to face her with the same calm intensity he had shown throughout the dialogue. "Fear of consequences is what has kept us silent for 60 years, he said simply. But silence in the face of injustice is not diplomacy, it is complicity. The world is changing. Young people everywhere are tired of polite lies and comfortable compromises. They want the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. But what about aid programs that might be cut because of your comments?" the journalist pressed. "Aren't you worried about the impact on your people?" For the first time since the confrontation, President Traore smiled not smugly, but with genuine warmth. "My people have survived colonialism, structural adjustment programs, debt crises, and decades of condescending aid. We will also survive the transition to dignity. In fact, we will thrive." The journalist scribbled furiously, realizing that every word from this man would be dissected and quoted for months to come. "Do you have a message for other African leaders watching this?" she asked. "The same message I have for leaders everywhere," President Traore replied. "Speak the truth. Serve your people. Remember that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned through actions, not words." And with that he walked away, leaving the journalist and a growing crowd of onlookers on the steps of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Within hours, the confrontation had exploded across every social media platform. The video was shared millions of times, dubbed and subtitled in dozens of languages. News networks worldwide led their evening broadcasts with the story. Political commentators tried to capture the moment's significance, while analysts debated its long-term implications. In Washington, D.C., Rubio's advisors worked frantically to craft a response that could salvage the situation. But how do you respond to a critique so precise and devastating without appearing defensive or spiteful? In Africa, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. From Lagos to Cairo, from Johannesburg to Nairobi, people watched the video with a mix of pride, awe, and hope. Here, at last, was a leader who had said what they had thought for decades, but had never heard articulated so powerfully on such a stage. University students organized watch parties. Social media influencers created reaction videos. Artists began producing murals and digital artwork inspired by the moment. The phrase, "I return both," became a rallying cry for movements demanding dignity across the continent and beyond. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from other world leaders. In private conversations in the days that followed, many admitted that President Traoré's words had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about their own approaches to international relations. Some began quietly reassessing their aid programs and diplomatic strategies, recognizing that the old models might no longer be sustainable in a world where younger leaders were increasingly unwilling to accept disrespect disguised as support. The confrontation in Washington, D.C. had lasted less than 15 minutes, but its impact would be felt for years to come. It marked the moment when the post-colonial order began to crack, when assumptions about the West's moral authority started to crumble, when a new generation of leaders asserted themselves with clarity and courage. Ibrahim Traoré had arrived in Washington as the president of a small, landlocked African nation. He left as the voice of a movement, the embodiment of a new kind of leadership that refused to trade dignity for support, respect for resources, or truth for comfort. The world would never be quite the same. And perhaps that was exactly what it needed. But the story didn't end there. In fact, what happened next would prove that words, when spoken with absolute conviction, can indeed reshape reality. 3 days after the event in Washington, something unprecedented began to unfold. It started quietly, almost invisibly, in the corridors of power where real decisions are made, far from the cameras and microphones. In Berlin, Chancellor Friedrich Merz convened an urgent meeting with his development ministers. The topic was not officially recorded, but sources close to the discussion later revealed that the German leader was profoundly affected by President Traoré's words. "We need to examine whether our aid programs are truly empowering recipients or merely making them more dependent on us," he was quoted as saying. Within a week, Germany announced a comprehensive review of its African development initiatives, focusing on what they called dignity-centered partnerships. Similar conversations were unfolding in capitals across Europe and North America. French President Emmanuel Macron, who had sat motionless during the Washington confrontation, privately admitted to his closest advisers that President Traoré had articulated something we've all tried to ignore. France began quietly restructuring its relationships with former African colonies, though they were careful not to frame it as a direct response to the Washington incident. Even in Washington, D.C., where Secretary Rubio's team was still grappling with the fallout, career diplomats and development experts started having candid discussions about whether the U.S. approach to foreign aid was achieving its stated goals or merely perpetuating the problems it claimed to address. But the real revolution was happening in Africa itself. In Accra, President John Mahama, Nana Akufo-Addo, watched the Washington video 3 times before calling his cabinet into an emergency session. "This young man said what we've all been thinking for decades," he told his ministers. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Within days, Mahama announced plans to renegotiate certain aid agreements, particularly those with policy requirements that undermined national sovereignty. Mahama's finance minister was quoted as saying, "Aid must enhance our self-governance, not weaken it." Similar movements began emerging across the continent. In Kenya, university students organized large protests in support of what they called the dignity doctrine. In Nigeria, influential Afrobeat artist Burna Boy released a song titled "Return Both," sampling audio from President Traoré's speech, which quickly became an anthem for young Africans, demanding respect from international partners. The social media explosion was unlike anything political observers had seen. The hashtag number #ReturnBoth trended in over 40 countries, but it wasn't just Africans sharing the content. Young people in Latin America, Asia, and even parts of Europe began using the phrase to challenge their own experiences with condescending aid and development policies. A particularly powerful moment occurred when a group of indigenous leaders from Latin America released a video responding to President Traoré's speech. What you said in Washington, Maria Santos, a Bolivian indigenous rights activist, declared, applies to every community that's been told they need saving by the very people who created their problems in the first place. The phrase, dignity-centered development, began appearing in academic papers, policy proposals, and UN documents. International development organizations found themselves scrambling to revise mission statements and program designs to address the so-called Washington Challenge. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré was facing a different kind of pressure. His phone rang constantly with interview requests from major international media outlets, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, France 24. Everyone wanted to capture more of the magic that had shaken Washington. But President Traoré remained selective, agreeing only to interviews where he could discuss substantive policy alternatives rather than simply recounting the confrontation. In a particularly revealing interview with BBC's Zainab Badawi, he explained his philosophy. The goal was never to embarrass anyone or reject all forms of international cooperation. The goal is to establish that cooperation must happen between equals, not between benefactors and beneficiaries. When you treat someone as if they will always need help, you rob them of the agency to become truly independent. But not everyone was celebrating. Western think tanks and policy institutes began publishing articles questioning whether President Traoré's approach was realistic or sustainable. The Heritage Foundation released a report titled The Dangers of Aid Nationalism, while the Council on Foreign Relations warned of rising anti-Western sentiment disguised as sovereignty movements. Corporate interests were particularly anxious. Mining companies, agribusinesses, and pharmaceutical giants that had structured their African operations around aid dependency relationships began seeing their business models challenged. Stock prices for some major corporations with significant African operations dropped noticeably in the weeks following the Washington event. The strongest corporate reaction came from Total Energies, the French oil and gas giant with extensive operations in West Africa. CEO Patrick Pouyanné held an emergency board meeting to discuss what he called the Traoré effect on their regional operations. Internal documents later leaked to the press revealed the company was considering withdrawing from certain African countries where they feared new dignity-based policies might threaten their preferential agreements. The corporation's concerns were not unfounded. In Chad, President Mahamat Déby announced that his government would review all extractive industry contracts to ensure they deliver fair value for our resources and respect our sovereignty. Similar statements came from leaders in Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The economic implications were staggering. Bloomberg estimated that if even half of sub-Saharan African countries adopted the kind of sovereignty-first policies President Traoré advocated, it could redirect hundreds of billions of dollars in resource revenue from multinational corporations to national development programs. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from China, which had quietly observed the entire affair. Unlike Western powers, which reacted defensively to President Traoré's criticisms, Beijing saw an opportunity. Chinese officials began reaching out to African leaders, offering what they called true partnerships based on mutual respect and shared prosperity. China's approach was sophisticated. Instead of directly criticizing Western aid models, they simply offered alternatives. We don't ask you to change your political systems, Chinese Commerce Minister Wang Wentao told a group of African trade ministers. We don't ask you to adopt our values. We simply want to do business as equals. This put Western governments in an untenable position. The more they criticized President Traoré's unrealistic demands for dignity and respect, the more they reinforced his argument that they viewed African leaders as children incapable of making their own decisions. The more they insisted their aid came with no strings attached, the more obvious it became that those strings had always been there. Meanwhile, Secretary Marco Rubio was grappling with a political identity crisis. His brand had always been built on projecting strength, never backing down, and always having the last word. But the Washington event had left him speechless, and the longer he remained silent, the more his silence was interpreted as a concession. His advisers were divided. Some urged him to double down, attacking President Traoré more aggressively and defending U.S. aid programs more forcefully. Others argued that any response would only draw more attention to the incident and make Rubio appear defensive. The decision was made for him when Fox News host Tucker Carlson aired a segment titled "The Ingratitude of Ibrahim Traoré." The segment was meant to defend Rubio and attack the Burkina Faso president, but backfired spectacularly. Carlson's condescending tone and cherry-picked statistics about U.S. aid to Africa only reinforced President Traoré's original argument about Western paternalism. The backlash was swift and fierce. African-American leaders who had remained silent during the initial Washington confrontation now spoke out forcefully. When you dismiss a legitimate concern from an African leader about dignity and respect, civil rights activist Reverend Al Sharpton said, "You're not just attacking him, you're attacking the fundamental principle that all people deserve to be treated as equals." The Congressional Black Caucus issued a statement endorsing President Traoré's call for dignity-centered international relationships. Several prominent African-American celebrities, including Oprah Winfrey and Michael Jordan, used their platforms to amplify President Traoré's message. Even more damaging to Secretary Rubio was the response from younger Republican politicians who saw an opportunity to distance themselves from what they viewed as an outdated approach to international relations. Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, often mentioned as a potential presidential candidate, gave a speech at Georgetown University calling for a new model of American leadership that empowers rather than patronizes our international partners. The Washington moment had created a political realignment that no one had anticipated. Traditional divides between left and right seemed less relevant when the core issue was whether international relationships should be based on mutual respect or hierarchical dominance. This became even clearer as unexpected voices began endorsing President Traoré's stance. Libertarian politicians, who typically opposed foreign aid, found themselves praising his call for dignity and self-reliance. Progressive activists, who often advocated for increased development aid, began questioning whether that aid truly empowered recipients or merely perpetuated dependence. The intellectual impact was equally profound. Universities began offering new courses on post-colonial development theory and dignity-centered international relations. Academic conferences previously focused on aid effectiveness began exploring questions of recipient self-determination and autonomy. A particularly influential paper published in Harvard's Kennedy School's Foreign Affairs argued that President Traoré had identified a fundamental flaw in post-World War II international development thinking. "We've operated under the assumption that good intentions justify paternalistic methods," Dr. Sarah Chen, the paper's lead author, wrote. But as President Traoré demonstrated, those receiving our help have their own perspectives on what constitutes genuine support versus sophisticated control. The business world was also adapting, though not always in ways Western corporations preferred. A new generation of African entrepreneurs began building companies explicitly designed to reduce dependence on Western technology, financing, and expertise. The African Solutions for African Problems movement gained momentum with successful startups in fintech, agriculture, and renewable energy, proving that the continent could indeed innovate and scale without perpetual external guidance. One particularly successful example was a Kenyan agritech company that developed drought-resistant seeds tailored specifically for East African conditions. Instead of relying on Western research institutes and seed companies, they built partnerships with local universities and traditional farming communities. Within 2 years, their innovations were adopted across the region, creating thousands of jobs and reducing food insecurity without any foreign aid. Stories like these began appearing regularly in international business media, challenging the narrative that African development required Western intervention. The Economist published a cover story titled "Africa's Dignity Dividend," documenting how countries adopting sovereignty-first policies were actually attracting more investment and achieving better development outcomes than those still reliant on aid. But the strongest validation of President Traoré's message came from an unexpected source, the next generation of African leadership itself. In South Africa, Julius Malema, the controversial leader of the economic freedom fighters, hosted a continent-wide summit titled "Dignity and Development: Africa's New Path." While Malema's rhetoric was often divisive, the summit attracted moderate leaders from across Africa who were serious about implementing sovereignty-based development strategies. The summit's final declaration was notable for its specificity. Rather than merely critiquing existing aid relationships, it outlined concrete alternatives, continent-wide trade agreements to reduce reliance on external markets, technology transfer programs to build local capacity rather than perpetual dependence, and resource extraction policies to ensure fair compensation for Africa's natural wealth. Even more significantly, the summit announced the creation of the African Dignity Fund, a continent-wide investment vehicle to provide development financing without the policy conditions often attached to Western aid. The fund was launched with an initial $50 billion, with contributions from African governments, the African diaspora, and private investors who believed in the continent's potential for self-reliant growth. The fund's first major investment was in renewable energy infrastructure across the Sahel region, including Burkina Faso. But unlike typical development projects, this one was designed, implemented, and managed entirely by African institutions. The symbolic significance was as critical as the practical impact. Africa was proving it could solve its own problems when given the resources and respect it deserved. International reactions to these developments revealed the deep anxieties President Traoré's Washington speech had exposed. Western media often took a dismissive tone, questioning whether African institutions had the capacity to effectively manage large-scale projects. But these criticisms only reinforced the original point about paternalism. More thoughtful Western observers recognized that something fundamental was shifting. "What we're witnessing," Thomas Friedman wrote in the New York Times, "is not anti-Western sentiment, but pro-African confidence. There's a difference, and our ability to understand that difference will determine whether we remain relevant partners or become irrelevant spectators." The transformation was happening on multiple levels simultaneously. While governments renegotiated aid agreements and corporations restructured their African operations, ordinary citizens across the continent were embracing a new sense of agency and self-worth. At universities from Lagos to Addis Ababa, students began organizing Dignity Week celebrations with discussions on post-colonial identity, economic sovereignty, and self-determination. These were not angry anti-Western rallies, but thoughtful explorations of what genuine partnership could look like. perhaps most crucially, the conversations were spreading beyond Africa. In Bangladesh, student leaders began questioning why their country accepted development aid tied to requirements to purchase goods and services from donor nations. In Bolivia, indigenous communities started demanding that international NGOs operating on their land act as partners rather than benefactors. The Washington Principles dignity, sovereignty, mutual respect and genuine partnership were becoming a global framework for reimagining international development relationships. 6 months after the confrontation, President Ibrahim Traoré was invited to address the United Nations General Assembly. The speech was highly anticipated, with world leaders curious to see whether he would maintain his confrontational approach or adopt a more diplomatic tone now that he had gained global recognition. What they got was something more nuanced than either extreme. President Traoré used the UN platform not to attack Western aid policies, but to articulate a positive vision of what international cooperation could look like when based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical charity. "We do not reject partnership," he told the delegates. "We reject paternalism. We do not reject support. We reject the assumption that support requires surrendering dignity. We do not oppose cooperation. We oppose the idea that cooperation means some nations must always be givers, while others must always be receivers." The speech outlined specific policy proposals, technology transfer programs to build local capacity rather than perpetual dependence, trade agreements enabling developing nations to add value to their resources before export, and investment frameworks prioritizing long-term partnerships over short-term extraction. But the most powerful moment came at the end of the speech when President Traoré addressed the broader implications of the dignity principle. "When we speak of dignity," he said, "we are not only speaking of Africa's relationship with the West. We are speaking of a fundamental principle that governs all human interactions. It is the recognition that every person, every community, every nation has inherent value that cannot be traded for material gain. This principle applies to indigenous communities in the Americas, to minority peoples in Asia, to working-class families in Europe and North America. Dignity is not an African issue. It is a human issue." The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, led not only by African delegates, but also by representatives from across the global South, and even some from developed nations who recognized the universal applicability of President Traoré's message. In the year that followed, the dignity doctrine became a recognized framework in international relations theory. Law schools began teaching courses on dignity-based international law. Business schools offered programs on respect-centered global commerce. Even military academies started incorporating dignity principles into training on international cooperation and peacekeeping. The Washington confrontation had lasted less than 15 minutes, but its ripple effects continued to reshape international relations in ways no one could have predicted. Ibrahim Traoré did not merely challenge Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He challenged an entire system of thinking about power, partnership, and human dignity that had dominated global politics for decades. The world had truly changed, and perhaps that was exactly what it needed. The story of President Traoré and his powerful confrontation in Washington, D.C., where he challenged Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the system of international relations, offers valuable lessons for modern American society. The message that dignity cannot be given, it can only be recognized or destroyed, resonates deeply, particularly in the context of social debates often dominated by power and finance. In American society, we frequently see movements demanding equality from racial justice for African Americans to self-determination for indigenous communities to workers fighting for their rights. Just as Traoré rejected conditional aid, Americans are learning to reject help or promises that come with the cost of stripping away self-worth or undermining autonomy. The lesson here is that true value lies not in what one receives, but in how one protects and maintains their dignity. President Traoré's courage to speak the truth, however difficult, sparked a global wave of change, fueling a movement for dignity-centered development. This shows that when an individual dares to stand up for their convictions, the impact can far exceed expectations. For every American, this lesson encourages us to find our own voice, defend our dignity and that of others, and continually question power structures that may undermine core human values. It is the refusal to stay silent when others expect you to remain quiet. If this story of the power of dignity has touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to stay updated on insightful analyses of how one voice daring to speak the truth can change the world. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video as we explore President Traoré's unexpected journey at a court in France.